Thursday afternoon when I received the letter. The envelope was from the Greater Oakwood Homeowners Association, something I'd grown accustomed to getting over the years from minor neighborhood updates or maintenance notices. But as I pulled the paper from the envelope, I noticed the subject, violation notice, pet enclosure issue. I immediately felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I had a large, well-built dog kennel in my backyard for my two rescue dogs, a Great Dane and a Shepherd mix, both of whom had been with me for years. They had plenty of space to roam and play, and I'd spent a lot of time and money ensuring their kennel was a safe, comfortable environment. But there it was in black and white. Karen Whitaker, the president of the HOA, was demanding that I remove the kennel. According to the letter, the structure violated the community's aesthetic guidelines and needed to be dismantled immediately. They even included a fine for the non-compliant structure. I couldn't believe what I was reading. As an animal rights lawyer, I knew the importance of proper animal care, and I knew that what Karen was claiming had no legal basis. My dogs had a proper, legally compliant kennel built according to animal welfare laws, with more than enough space for them to enjoy. There was no reason the HOA should be getting involved in how I cared for my pets. I set the letter aside for a moment, trying to calm myself. It was clear this was Karen's personal crusade, likely based on her idea of what the neighborhood should look like rather than any legitimate rule violation. Still, I knew I needed to take action. I took a deep breath, grabbed my phone, and called my neighbor Tom, who had a similar setup for his dogs. If anyone could help me figure out what the HOA's real motivations were, it was him. As soon as he picked up, I got right to the point. "Tom, have you seen the letter from the HOA? They're trying to make me remove my dog kennel," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Tom was silent for a moment before answering. "Yeah, I got one too about my dog run. Same thing. Karen says it doesn't fit with the aesthetic of the neighborhood." I was taken aback. "You've got to be kidding me. She's going after you too." Tom chuckled bitterly. "Looks like she's got a thing about dogs. It's all about keeping up appearances, and as usual, we're the ones who don't fit her vision." I hung up with a sense of determination. This wasn't just about my dog kennel. It was about Karen trying to control what people did with their own property, all in the name of maintaining her version of perfection. And I wasn't going to let her bully me or anyone else into submission. After talking to Tom, I was more convinced than ever that Karen wasn't acting on any formal community concerns. This was personal. The fact that she was targeting both of us in our pet enclosures, seemingly without a real basis in the HOA rules, made it clear she was using her position to push her own agenda. The first thing I did was grab a copy of the HOA's governing documents. I needed to see what, if anything, they had on file about pet enclosures, outdoor structures, or aesthetics. As an animal rights lawyer, I knew that no one had the right to interfere with my pet's well-being unless it was causing a legitimate safety or health issue. I spent the next few hours combing through the HOA's rules and regulations. To my surprise, there was nothing in the guidelines that explicitly mentioned dog kennels. There were a few vague rules about keeping the property lines neat and in good repair and avoiding structures that could detract from the neighborhood's appearance, but nothing specific about how pet enclosures should be maintained. This gave me some hope. It seemed like Karen was just creating problems where there were none. I took a few photos of the kennel, documenting its construction and the ample space my dogs had. The fence was solid, the flooring was soft, and the dogs had plenty of shade during the day. There were no sharp edges or exposed wires. If anything, it was a better setup than some of the more haphazard yards I had seen in the neighborhood. I made sure to write a detailed description of the kennel's design, how it complied with animal welfare regulations, and how it met the local zoning codes for residential properties. The next step was to draft a formal response to the HOA. I needed to make it clear that this wasn't a fight over aesthetics, it was a legal matter. I wasn't about to let Karen's personal preferences dictate how I cared for my dogs, especially when the kennel didn't violate any laws or HOA regulations. I spent the evening drafting a letter, outlining my legal rights as an animal owner and explaining that the kennel was not just a structure, but a responsible choice made in the best interest of my pet's health and safety. I included references to animal welfare laws, noting how the kennel exceeded basic legal standards for pet care. I also reminded the HOA that they could not arbitrarily enforce rules based on personal biases, especially when those rules did not exist in their formal documents. The next morning, I sent the letter off to Karen and the HOA board. I knew this might escalate, but I was prepared. I had spent enough time in legal battles to know how to stand my ground. If Karen tried to take this further, I would take legal action. My dog's well-being came first, and I wasn't about to back down. A few days after sending the letter, I received a response from Karen. This time, it wasn't just a letter from her. It was a formal notice from the HOA board outlining their concerns in more detail. The letter accused me of violating the neighborhood's aesthetic standards and claimed that my dog kennel compromised the appearance and harmony of the community. They demanded that the kennel be removed within 30 days, threatening a $1,000 fine if I failed to comply. The tone was not just firm, it was threatening. Reading through the letter, I could feel my frustration rising. It was clear that Karen wasn't going to let this go. The HOA was backing her up, despite the fact that there were no official guidelines on pet enclosures, and no one had formally complained about my dogs or the kennel. It was all just Karen's personal vendetta masquerading as community concern. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that I wasn't just defending my kennel. I was defending my legal rights as a homeowner and an animal rights advocate. I wasn't going to let Karen bully me, and I knew she was overstepping her boundaries. This was a matter of principle, not just aesthetics. The next day, I called up a friend of mine, a fellow attorney who specialized in property law and had experience with HOA disputes. I explained the situation, and she agreed that Karen's actions were likely not legal. She suggested that I take the next step and file a formal complaint with the local zoning board. If the HOA was truly acting outside of their jurisdiction, it could be considered an unlawful interference with my property rights. With her advice, I started preparing the next move. I drafted a second, more forceful response to the HOA, this time copying in the local zoning office and requesting an official review of the situation. I included evidence of how the kennel met local zoning codes and animal welfare standards, and emphasized that no part of the HOA's documents or bylaws supported their demand. I also reached out to a few neighbors who owned dogs and had similar setups. To my surprise, many of them were feeling the pressure from Karen, even if their own kennels had never been directly targeted. It turned out that Karen had been quietly enforcing aesthetic standards with a heavy hand, pressuring residents who had outdoor dog enclosures to take them down. Some had complied just to avoid conflict, but others were just as fed up as I was. Armed with statements from my neighbors supporting my cause, I organized a meeting with the HOA board. This was no longer just a personal issue. It was now about standing up for the rights of all pet owners in the community. The next step was to show up at that meeting, prepared to present my case, armed with legal facts and the support of fellow homeowners. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and I made sure to arrive early. I was prepared to present my case, calmly, confidently, and with all the legal documentation in hand. I wasn't just defending my dog kennel anymore. I was standing up for every homeowner in the neighborhood who had felt the pressure of Karen's unreasonable demands. The room was filled with the usual suspects. Karen sitting at the front with her clipboard, and the rest of the HOA board members looking uncomfortable and clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. As I walked into the room, I noticed a few familiar faces from the neighborhood, neighbors who owned dogs, who had been quietly backing me up. Tom, my neighbor, was there too, sitting at the back of the room. He gave me a thumbs up, and I took a deep breath, walking confidently to the front where Karen was waiting. Mr. Callahan, Karen began, her voice dripping with that forced politeness she always used when she thought she was in control. Thank you for coming. We're here to discuss your dog kennel and your refusal to comply with the HOA's guidelines. I cut her off before she could continue. Actually, Karen, I said firmly, I'm here today not just to discuss my kennel, but to address the larger issue you're trying to create for homeowners in this neighborhood. A few of the board members exchanged glances, clearly surprised by my direct approach, but I didn't back down. I had every right to be here, and I wasn't about to let Karen intimidate me into silence. I've reviewed the HOA guidelines, I continued, and there's absolutely nothing in them that supports your demand to remove my dog kennel. You're trying to enforce arbitrary aesthetic rules without any legal or factual basis. My kennel is a safe, humane environment for my dogs, and it fully complies with local zoning and animal welfare laws. There's no law or rule here that justifies what you're doing. Karen opened her mouth to interrupt, but I raised my hand to signal that I wasn't done. I've also spoken to other residents, and many of them are too intimidated to stand up to you. They've complied with your demands, even though they too have legal and moral rights to keep their pets properly housed. I'm here today to represent not just myself, but those homeowners who don't feel like they can speak out. There was a brief silence in the room. I could see that some of the board members were starting to soften. Karen, on the other hand, looked livid but was clearly trying to hold it together. You've crossed the line, Karen. I said, leaning forward slightly. The HOA has no right to interfere with how I care for my pets as long as they're well cared for and housed properly. Your personal preference for aesthetic harmony cannot supersede my legal rights as a homeowner. If this continues, I will have no choice but to pursue legal action. I've already consulted with my attorney, and I'm ready to take this to court if necessary. I handed out copies of a letter I had sent to the zoning office, the legal documentation supporting my case, and statements from my neighbors, some of whom were now nodding in agreement. It was clear that the room was shifting in my favor. Karen finally spoke up, her voice tight with frustration. We're just trying to maintain the neighborhood standards. You can't just do whatever you want with your property. I shook my head. The standards you're talking about aren't even written down anywhere in your documents, Karen. What you're enforcing is based on your personal preferences, not any official guidelines. I'm here to ensure that doesn't continue. The rest of the meeting played out in a tense silence as the board members began discussing what to do. I could tell they were rattled, no longer able to stand behind Karen's demands without legal justification. After about 20 minutes of back and forth, the board called a vote. To my relief, the board voted unanimously to reject Karen's request and ruled that there was no basis for removing my dog kennel. Not only that, but they also made a formal statement that there would be no future attempts to regulate pet enclosures unless it directly affected the safety of the community. Karen's authority was officially undermined. The room erupted in quiet applause as my neighbors, who had been waiting in the back, stood up and clapped. Tom came over to give me a congratulatory handshake. That was awesome, man. You really showed them. Karen, however, was seething. She barely muttered a goodbye as she stormed out of the room, clearly humiliated. The rest of the board members looked relieved that the matter was finally over, but I knew this wasn't the last time I'd hear from Karen. The HOA's decision was a massive win, and I left the meeting feeling like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But as I walked back to my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wouldn't just let this go. She had a way of turning every small victory into a personal vendetta, and I knew that this defeat would only fuel her desire for revenge. A few days later, I received a call from my neighbor Tom. He sounded anxious. Hey, Mike, I need to talk to you. Karen's not giving up. She's been going door to door talking to people about proper pet management and trying to stir up trouble again. I think she's trying to get support for a new petition to remove your kennel. She's not backing down. I rubbed my temples, trying to suppress the frustration that was building up again. It seemed Karen wasn't just obsessed with her own ideas about the neighborhood's appearance, she was bent on making everyone else live by her standards too. I called a meeting with my lawyer to discuss my options. The last thing I wanted was to be drawn into another round of legal back and forth with Karen, but I needed to protect myself in case she escalated things further. As we reviewed the situation, we realized that Karen was trying to gather support from other homeowners, most of whom had quietly complied with her demands out of fear. My lawyer advised me to send a letter to all the neighbors, explaining my legal position and making it clear that Karen's actions had no basis in the HOA's rules. The goal was to prevent any further manipulation or coercion. I wrote a carefully worded letter, emphasizing the rights of homeowners to keep pets and make decisions about how to care for them without fear of arbitrary interference. I also made it clear that if Karen or the HOA attempted to go after me again, I would be prepared to escalate the situation and involve legal authorities. To my surprise, the response from my neighbors was overwhelmingly positive. Many of them were relieved to know that they weren't the only ones dealing with Karen's heavy-handed tactics. A few even came forward, expressing their support and sharing their own stories of being intimidated into removing pet enclosures or other outdoor structures. It became clear that Karen wasn't just targeting me. She was creating an atmosphere of fear where people felt too nervous to stand up for their own rights. The next day, I met with Tom and a few other neighbors who had offered support. We decided it was time to hold a community meeting. We weren't just going to sit back and let Karen continue her reign of fear. This was the moment to unite the neighborhood and set the record straight. Karen's personal preferences could not dictate what we did with our homes and our pets. We invited as many neighbors as possible, and the meeting was set for the following week. I prepared a brief presentation to explain the legal framework of homeowners' rights regarding pets, pet enclosures, and HOA regulations. The goal wasn't to get everyone to agree with me, but to make sure people understood that Karen was out of line and that the HOA had no legal grounds to enforce her arbitrary rules. When the day of the meeting arrived, the turnout was better than I had hoped. Dozens of neighbors showed up, many of them quietly nodding along as I outlined the legal protections we all had when it came to maintaining our homes and caring for our pets. The more I spoke, the more I realized how many people were afraid to speak out, even though they disagreed with Karen's overreach. As the meeting continued, one by one, neighbors began to share their own experiences. Some talked about being pressured to remove doghouses or fences, while others revealed how Karen had insisted on approving every little outdoor change in their yards, from garden layouts to the color of fences. It was becoming clear that Karen's behavior had created an oppressive environment for many, and that it was time to put an end to it. By the end of the meeting, there was a unanimous agreement. It was time to stand up to Karen and the HOA. A petition was drafted to formally ask for a change in the HOA's bylaws to prevent further interference with pet enclosures, fences, and other personal property decisions. The petition included a request for a new community meeting to address the overreach, and it quickly gathered signatures from nearly every neighbor who had attended. Karen was about to realize that her efforts to divide the community were going to backfire. This was no longer just about one dog kennel. It was about the right of every homeowner to have a voice in how their property was managed and to live without fear of unreasonable control. The petition quickly gained traction. By the time we had collected enough signatures, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted. What had once been a divided, fearful community under Karen's rule was now united and determined to push back against her overreach. Word spread, and more residents came forward to show their support, not just for my kennel, but for the broader principle that Karen and the HOA couldn't dictate how people manage their properties. The day of the next HOA meeting arrived, and this time I wasn't alone. We had a room full of neighbors who were ready to make their voices heard. Tom, along with several others who had signed the petition, stood by my side as we prepared to present our case. We had a clear agenda: demand that the HOA stop enforcing arbitrary aesthetic rules and that they begin to respect homeowners' rights to manage their properties without unwarranted interference. Karen, of course, was still there, sitting at the head of the table with her ever-present clipboard. But this time, she wasn't in control. The room felt different. As I took my seat at the front, I saw that some of the other board members were visibly uncomfortable. The power had shifted, and Karen was about to feel the full force of the community's collective will. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and addressed the board directly. As you all know, I've been here before. And while the issue started with my dog kennel, it's become about something much bigger. It's about the right of every homeowner here to live freely and make choices about their own property. I'm not the only one who's been harassed by Karen's rules. Others in this neighborhood are too afraid to speak up, but we've come together today to make sure our voices are heard. I paused to let my words sink in, then continued. This isn't just about one kennel. This is about every homeowner's right to have pets, build structures, and make changes to their homes as long as they comply with zoning and animal welfare laws. If we let this go unchecked, Karen will continue to impose her personal preferences on all of us, and that's not what the HOA should be about. The board members exchanged glances, some looking uncomfortable, others embarrassed. It was clear that this was no longer a simple dispute over aesthetics. It was about power and control. I wasn't just fighting for my kennel anymore. I was fighting for every resident who had been made to feel small or unheard. I handed the petition with over 50 signatures to the board secretary and continued. This petition shows that the majority of this community doesn't want Karen's overreach to continue. We're requesting that the HOA board update the community guidelines to reflect the rights of homeowners to maintain their properties, including reasonable pet enclosures, without fear of arbitrary restrictions. Karen tried to speak, but this time, the board was not as receptive. One of the members, Greg, a longtime neighbor who had quietly supported the petition, spoke up. I think it's time we revisit how we enforce these rules. We've seen the support for Mike's case, and maybe it's time to acknowledge that our guidelines need updating. We can't just allow personal biases to dictate what's acceptable in our community. That's not the kind of neighborhood we want to be. Karen's face reddened, and she opened her mouth to argue, but she was quickly cut off by another board member, Julia. Karen, I think we've heard enough. This is a serious concern, and we need to take it into account. Let's vote on it. The tension in the room was palpable as the board voted on whether to uphold Karen's decision or accept the community's petition. One by one, the votes were cast, and it was clear that Karen was losing her grip. When the vote was finally tallied, the result was unanimous. The board voted to reject Karen's demands to remove my dog kennel and agreed to review the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. The room erupted into applause, and for the first time, Karen looked defeated. She sat back in her chair, her face tight with frustration, knowing that her power had been stripped away. It was a massive win for me, for the community, and for every homeowner who had felt silenced by Karen's oppressive control. After the HOA meeting, there was a palpable sense of relief in the neighborhood. People were talking, smiling, and finally expressing what they had been holding back for years. I had won my fight, but it felt bigger than just my dog kennel. It was a victory for every homeowner who had been silently suffering under Karen's arbitrary rules. For the first time in a long time, it seemed like the community was regaining its voice. Over the next few weeks, I noticed something interesting. Karen, who had once been the center of attention in the neighborhood, started fading into the background. The HOA board began to operate more transparently, and Karen's personal influence seemed to wane. It was clear that the other board members, many of whom had been uncomfortable with her heavy-handed tactics, were now eager to shift the HOA's focus toward more constructive goals. There were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in years, the power dynamics in the neighborhood had shifted. The community itself began to change. More homeowners started to feel empowered to make improvements to their properties without fear of Karen's micromanagement. Tom, who had been hesitant to install a dog run because of Karen's past interference, finally got the approval to expand his backyard and build a proper outdoor play area for his dogs. Even neighbors who had never considered making changes to their yards started discussing ways they could improve their homes and make them more pet-friendly. The ripple effect of the victory was undeniable. People were talking more openly about the need for fairness and transparency within the HOA, and many residents reached out to me to express their gratitude. I realized that the victory wasn't just mine, it was for the entire community, and the sense of unity was stronger than ever. But, as I expected, Karen wasn't going to disappear quietly. A few weeks after the board meeting, I got a call from the HOA board secretary, Greg, who had been one of the key figures in rejecting Karen's demands. He sounded hesitant as he spoke. "Mike, I wanted to give you a heads up. Karen's been trying to rally some support behind the scenes. She's upset about the decision, and she's not happy that she's losing her influence. I just want to make sure you were aware in case she tries anything else." I appreciated the heads up, but it didn't surprise me. Karen wasn't the type to let go of power easily. I knew that at some point she'd try to cause trouble again, but this time I was prepared. I wasn't just defending my kennel anymore. I was standing up for the entire neighborhood, and I wasn't going to let her undo the progress we had made. Days later, I received a letter from Karen, addressed to me personally. It was a thinly veiled threat, written in that passive-aggressive tone she so often used. She mentioned how unfortunate it was that the neighborhood had allowed my flagrant disregard for HOA rules to set a precedent. She warned that, while she respected the board's decision, she felt that the community was now on a dangerous path. The letter concluded with a reminder that future violations could result in more scrutiny from the board. I read the letter twice, then threw it in the trash. Karen could try to intimidate me all she wanted, but the truth was that the HOA had already voted, and the neighborhood had already spoken. I had nothing to fear. The next day, I shared the letter with Greg and a few other board members who had supported the decision. They assured me that they were taking steps to ensure that Karen's influence wouldn't interfere with the new direction the HOA was taking. I wasn't worried. Karen had already lost. She was just grasping at the remnants of her control, but I knew the community had moved on. A few months passed, and life in the neighborhood returned to a sense of normalcy. The fear and tension that had once permeated every homeowner's decision were replaced with a renewed sense of ownership and empowerment. It felt good to see the community come together, knowing that I had played a role in making that happen. And as for Karen, well, she was still there, but her influence had been all but wiped away. She'd lost the support of the board, and the neighbors had seen her for what she truly was, someone who cared more about power than about the well-being of the people she was supposed to serve. It wasn't long before Karen quietly stepped down from her position on the HOA board, and the rest of the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. With Karen's departure from the HOA board, things in the neighborhood seemed to settle into a new normal. The tension that had once been so thick was now replaced with a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect. People were finally comfortable with the idea of standing up for their rights, and the community had begun to change for the better. But as the months passed, I realized that the real victory wasn't just about defeating Karen or even about my dog kennel. It was about the way the entire neighborhood had transformed, from being a place where people feared speaking out to one where homeowners took ownership of their space and lived without the looming threat of arbitrary rules. The victory was about empowerment, about creating a place where people could feel safe to be themselves, pursue their passions, and care for their pets without fear of interference. One afternoon, a few of my neighbors knocked on my door. It was Tom, along with a couple of other residents I'd grown close to during the HOA debacle. They had something to show me. "I think you'll want to see this," Tom said, holding up a large, folded document. I could tell from his smile that it was good news. They spread out the paper on my kitchen table, and I saw that it was a new petition, a petition to establish a new neighborhood initiative. The residents were proposing a community garden, open to all homeowners who wanted to grow fresh vegetables and herbs, and with a section designated for pets. The initiative was designed to promote sustainability, improve community bonds, and support families who might not have the space for gardens of their own. But the real kicker: the proposal included a clause that would formally protect homeowners' rights to have pet enclosures and to pursue other pet-friendly projects without interference from the HOA. "We've got the signatures," Tom said proudly. "We want you to be the one to present it to the board." I was stunned. "You're asking me to present a petition to the HOA? After everything that happened, we think you're the one who can make it happen," said another neighbor, Karen's former ally on the board, who had seen firsthand how the old regime had abused their power. "This community wouldn't be where it is without you. And now, with Karen out of the way, it's the perfect time for a fresh start." It was a proposal I hadn't expected, but one that filled me with pride. I started this journey just trying to protect my right to keep a dog kennel, but now I was being asked to help create something that could change the entire community for the better. Not just for pet owners, but for everyone. The idea was simple but powerful: to create a neighborhood that embraced sustainability, supported its residents, and allowed every homeowner to make the most of their property without fear of unreasonable interference. It was a vision that aligned with everything I had fought for: the right to live authentically and freely, without being beholden to someone else's narrow view of what was acceptable. A few weeks later, I stood in front of the newly elected HOA board, ready to present the petition. I had drafted a speech that was both practical and heartfelt, emphasizing the value of community, sustainability, and fairness. As I began to speak, I couldn't help but notice how different the room felt. The board members were paying attention, nodding in agreement, and taking notes. The atmosphere was collaborative, not confrontational. As I finished my presentation, I added, "This community garden is more than just a plot of land. It's a symbol of the kind of neighborhood we want to be. A place where everyone can feel empowered to take care of their homes, their pets, and the environment without fear of arbitrary restrictions. This is our opportunity to create something truly positive for the future." The board deliberated for a while, but the vote came down in favor of the proposal. Not only was the community garden approved, but the petition to protect pet enclosures was officially adopted into the HOA's updated guidelines. The new HOA policy recognized the importance of pet-friendly spaces and ensured that no future HOA president could arbitrarily force homeowners to remove their pet enclosures again. As the meeting concluded, I walked out of the room, my heart swelling with pride. This wasn't just a win for me. It was a win for the entire neighborhood. We had created a space where everyone's rights were respected, where the community worked together to support its members, and where we could make a lasting impact on the future of the neighborhood. As I left the meeting, I looked around at my neighbors, at Tom, who had supported me from the beginning, and the others who had come together to make this change happen. The neighborhood that had once been divided by fear was now united in a shared vision of growth, care, and mutual respect. Karen was long gone, but her impact on the community remained, a reminder of how far we had come. And now, as I looked forward, I knew that the battle had been won, not just for one dog kennel, but for the spirit of a whole community. The success of the community garden and the new HOA guidelines was just the beginning. As the months passed, I noticed a shift in the neighborhood. People started looking at each other differently. There was a renewed sense of unity, a feeling that we were all working toward the same goal of creating a vibrant, sustainable, and harmonious community. The garden flourished, with neighbors coming together to plant, maintain, and share the harvest. Pet enclosures, once a point of contention, were now a welcomed sight. We had become a model for what a community could be when people worked together, not out of fear, but out of shared respect for each other's rights and the environment. But not everyone was on board with the changes. One evening, I received an email from the HOA board notifying me that there was going to be a special meeting. The subject line was simple: upcoming discussion on HOA community standards. I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't just going to be a discussion on more community initiatives. When I arrived at the meeting, I was surprised to see some familiar faces from the past, the old board members who had backed Karen's agenda. A few new faces had appeared as well, looking uncertain but eager to contribute. The board had clearly been shaken by the positive changes that had been happening under the new leadership, and it seemed that Karen's influence was still casting a long shadow over the group. The meeting started as usual, with the board members giving updates on current projects. Then, one of the newer members, Lisa, spoke up. "I've received a lot of concerns from some of the older residents," she said, her voice tentative but determined. "They feel that the community garden and the new pet-friendly rules are starting to go too far. They're worried that the neighborhood is losing its charm and that the standards are being lowered. There's talk about reinstating some of the original aesthetic rules." The room fell quiet. I could sense the tension rising, and I knew exactly where this was headed. It wasn't just a conversation about aesthetics, it was a challenge to the very values that had transformed our neighborhood. I stood up, my heart racing but my voice steady. "What we've done here is not about lowering standards, it's about broadening our vision of what this neighborhood can be. The garden, the pet enclosures, these aren't just decorative choices. They're statements about the kind of community we want to live in, a place where people are free to enjoy their homes and pets without unreasonable restrictions, where sustainability is prioritized, and where every voice is heard." There were murmurs of agreement from some of the residents in the room, but Lisa wasn't backing down. "But what about the people who've lived here for years and feel that the changes are too radical? Shouldn't we consider their feelings?" I could feel the tension building. This was the same argument Karen had used in the past, and I knew it wasn't going to be easy to change minds that were entrenched in old ways. But I wasn't about to let fear dictate the future of our community. "Change is hard, I get that," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "But it's also necessary for growth. We've created a space that is more inclusive, more sustainable, and more connected. It's not about dismissing the past, it's about embracing the future. And we can do that while respecting the values that brought us together in the first place." For a long moment, there was silence. Then, one by one, some of the board members began to speak up, voicing their support for the changes we'd made. Greg, one of the longest-serving members, said, "I've seen a real shift in the neighborhood. People are happier. They're engaged. We've seen more community involvement in the garden and with the pet enclosures than ever before." Another board member, Julia, nodded. "I've had neighbors approach me, telling me how much they appreciate the new direction we're taking. The garden isn't just about aesthetics, it's about connection. It's about building something that benefits everyone." The room began to soften, and I could see that the argument was shifting in our favor. The old guard, those who had once been loyal to Karen's vision of the HOA, were starting to realize that change wasn't as threatening as they had thought. We didn't need to compromise on the integrity of the neighborhood, we just needed to find new ways to support and grow it. The meeting ended with a vote, and by the end, the board unanimously decided to solidify the changes we had made. The community garden would remain, and the updated pet policies would stay in place. Karen's vision of a strictly controlled, uniform neighborhood was officially put to rest. The HOA had finally embraced the values of inclusivity, sustainability, and respect for personal freedoms. As I walked out of the meeting, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. We had turned a small victory over my dog kennel into a movement that had reshaped the entire community. The real power, I realized, wasn't just in winning individual battles. It was in empowering people to come together and build something better.